Story 1. I was lying in bed one night, wide awake, when an old memory suddenly hit me. It's something I think about now and then, but for some reason, it felt extra disturbing that night. Maybe because, as an adult, I can finally grasp how terrifying it really was. I'm not sure if this belongs here, but it's a true story. I was about 13 years old, getting ready for school one morning. My dad was already at work, and my mom was getting ready for her job. Like every day, I was going to walk to school since it was only half a mile away. After saying goodbye, I headed out the door. I walked down the hill of our yard and onto the curved street that led to my school. I was out of sight of my house, but I wasn't far from it yet. I reached the end of my neighborhood, right where I'd crossed the street toward the school. That's when a beat-up, black minivan or van, I'm not sure which, pulled up right in front of me. I'd never seen this car before, and I haven't seen it since. The driver was a pasty-looking white guy who seemed like he was in his 30s, maybe older. He had messy brown hair, but what really got to me were his eyes. He had dark circles under them and this unsettling stare. The window was still up, but he motioned for me to come closer with his hand. My heart started pounding. Every instinct told me this guy was bad news. So, I just stood there, staring back at him, and shook my head no. I was half expecting him to jump out of the van, and I was ready to run. But he didn't. He just kept looking at me, completely unfazed, before he suddenly drove off, disappearing down the road. I don't remember much of what happened next. I think I ran home instead of going to school because I was so freaked out. I told my mom about it either that morning or later in the day. She told my dad, who's a police officer. He called me into the living room, where he was on his work laptop, and asked me to describe the guy and the van. But I didn't have much to offer. I was just a clueless middle school kid who didn't think to memorize the license plate or know anything about cars. Not surprisingly, my dad never found out anything about the man. The day passed, and it just became one of those weird things that happened, something we never talked about again. But every so often, I'd remember that creepy man in his old black van, waving me toward him. Only recently, though, has the memory started to fill me with real dread. Looking back, I can't help but think that if I'd walked up to him, I might have never been seen again. I could have been just another kid who vanished without a trace, leaving behind a grieving family and an unsolved mystery. The thought of what could have happened to me sends chills down my spine now that I know what people are capable of. Death isn't even the worst thing. Or maybe, just maybe, it was all in my head. Maybe he was lost and just needed directions. But his window was up, and he looked awful. I'll never know the truth. Maybe it was just the overactive imagination of a scared kid blowing things out of proportion. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. What haunts me the most is the thought that, before or after me, he might have found a kid who didn't shake their head no. Story 2. Back in 2008, I was dating a girl who lived in Abergavenny, South Wales, UK. Abergavenny is an old Welsh market town, full of ancient buildings and rich history. My ex, let's call her C, lived with her sister and mom in this old toll house on the corner of what used to be the main road centuries ago. The house had that classic Tudor look with black timber beams crisscrossing white stone walls. Though it was renovated in the early 1900s, the layout and site of the toll house had remained the same for hundreds of years. The living room was set low into the ground, with the house built on an embankment. This meant the rear wall of the living room was under the natural ground level. C once mentioned that behind the rear wall, there used to be an old access tunnel leading to the nearby castle, about 500 meters away. The ruins of the castle are still there. The tunnel had collapsed centuries ago, and the entrance was boarded up. The rear wall even had the remains of the tunnel's stone archway, but it was blocked off by a single layer of masonry. Back in medieval times, monks and people from the castle would use these tunnels to move in and out of the town. That collapsed tunnel behind the living room wall always intrigued me. There was always this cold draft coming from it, no matter the time of day, but I didn't think much of it until strange things started happening. The first weird thing happened when I wasn't there. I was on the phone with C one evening, just talking about school and whatever random stuff 15 or 16-year-olds talk about. Suddenly, In the middle of our conversation, I heard a whoosh and then a loud bang. C let out a tiny yelp. Then, silence. I asked if she was okay. After what felt like an eternity of silence, she shakily responded, yes, but my science textbook just flew off my shelf across the room at me. She brushed it off like it was nothing. Wait, what? I asked, confused. Yeah, it happens all the time. My house is very haunted, she said casually. She was so calm about it that it actually made me feel better, especially since I was supposed to stay there that weekend. But it also made me wonder, is this normal for her? Nothing strange happened for a while after that. But one evening, about 2 months later, we were watching TV in the living room when I heard what sounded like her little sister shuffling around upstairs. How long has your sister been home? I asked. She isn't home yet. Nobody is. She just texted me, C replied. We both looked up at the ceiling as we clearly heard more shuffling footsteps upstairs, creaking the floorboards. The footsteps sounded muffled, like someone who had just woken up. It's hard to explain, but it was definitely footsteps. We were both creeped out but went upstairs to check if someone had broken in through the back window. A burglar had gotten in that way before. But we found no one. All the windows and doors were closed. We went into C's bedroom, left the door slightly ajar, and sat there quietly, trying to hear the footsteps again. After several minutes of sitting in that uneasy silence, we decided to head back downstairs since we didn't hear anything. What happened next is something I'll never forget. As I reached for the bedroom door to push it open, the door, which was already slightly open, suddenly slammed in my face with the loudest bang I've ever heard. It felt like someone had slammed it shut from the other side. Instinctively, I grabbed the doorknob to open it, but I could feel resistance, like someone was holding it from the other side. I tried to turn the knob, but it snapped back with force. It felt like someone was playing a prank on us, leaning all their weight against the door. I could even hear the old timber door creaking under the pressure. Then, just as suddenly, the resistance stopped. The door swung open easily. There was no way someone could have done that and then hidden somewhere in the house that quickly. We rushed from room to room, but found no one. All the windows were closed, and the front door was still locked from the inside. As I thought about what had just happened, I realized something that sent chills down my spine. When the door slammed shut, the light that was coming through the slightly open door was gone. It was pitch black, like something dark and solid had been blocking the light. That image still creeps me out to this day. After that, things started going bump in the night. One night, I stayed over in the guest room. I got up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom, which was downstairs. On my way back up, I heard a loud thump coming from the living room. I stared into the darkness beyond the old, crooked doorway leading into the living room. The thump was coming from the rear wall, like someone softly hitting a hollow wall. It was as if someone or something was behind the wall where the collapsed tunnel entrance was. I froze in shock. Thump, thump, thump. My eyes started watering with pure fear, something I'd never felt before. Then I bolted upstairs and woke up C. We sat on her bedroom floor, listening to the thumping for what felt like 30 minutes. It gradually got slower and softer until it finally stopped. I'm sure other things happened in that house that I didn't notice. C's mom used to drink a lot and would tell us vague stories about hearing moaning behind the living room wall most nights. I even saw C's bedroom door open on its own behind her on webcam, and once, her mirror was thrown off the wall and smashed on the ground. Whatever was in that house had a sad, but sinister vibe to it. We broke up not long after that, and I never went back. But recently, 16 years later, I drove past that house, and it gave me chills like nothing else. Story 3. Back in 2022, my dad and I decided to hike up Mount St. Helens. Hiking together was nothing new for us, so we were pretty used to it. In fact, I'm heading back to hike the same mountain tomorrow. But this particular hike was different from all the others. Mount St. Helens is a bit over 4 miles up, with about 1 to 2 miles through a wooded area before you start hiking up the rocky, open parts. Just as we exited the wooded section and started up the first set of rocks, we heard a voice. It screamed, "Dad." The weirdest part? It sounded exactly like my brother's voice. Now, here's the thing, my brother was supposed to come with us on this trip. We were in the area, and this hike was one of the activities we had planned. But my brother didn't want to join. He's out of shape, very unathletic, and honestly, he hates hiking. So when we heard this voice that sounded just like him, my dad and I turned to each other, both thinking the same thing. Did we really just hear that? And sure enough, we both heard it. There was no doubt in our minds that it sounded exactly like my brother. Here's where it gets even stranger. We were already 1 to 2 miles into the hike, so we knew there was no way my brother had come this far. We stood there for a while, just waiting to see if anyone else was around, but no one came. No one had passed us on their way down for a long time, so it couldn't have been that. To make matters worse, a thick fog rolled into that exact spot while we were standing there, waiting. We didn't want to take any chances, so we decided to keep hiking up. We made it to the top without any other problems and then headed back down. Once we were down, we asked my brother if he had come up the trail after all. All he said was, "I never left the car." That experience has left a mark on my dad and me that we'll never forget. Update, we completed the entire hike again with no issues, but every time we passed that spot, there were always people around, unlike the last time. But while we were walking through the forest on the way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I never saw anything, so I don't know what it was, but that feeling was hard to ignore.